¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Esto es Malvinas Historia de Héroes y Traidores, programa número 286 en su 10ª temporada. Hoy veremos el final del documental británico, que lo tuvimos que cortar en 3 partes porque era muy largo. Y solo voy a hacer una aclaración para cuando llegue ese momento, que es el final de la guerra. Los británicos describen que los soldados argentinos estaban desmoralizados. Es mentira, pero después aclaran que la oficialidad joven quería seguir combatiendo. Vamos al video.
Para are making good progress until they reached this spot on the north side of Darwin Hill. This was the point at which Colonel H. Jones's plan started to go badly wrong. One company were pinned down there by fire from well-placed machine guns up on the hill. It was rapidly becoming clear that there were more Argentinians than they had thought, and what's more, their will to fight was strong.
Then the sun began to rise and light flooded across Goose Green, illuminating the men on the wide open battlefield. The men of 2 Para on the low ground were completely exposed to Argentinian fire and couldn't advance. Somebody had to do something. It was time for Colonel H. Jones to do what he thought he did best, lead from the front. He identified an isolated Argentinian position just up there that he thought he could take out on his own. Clutching his submachine gun, he charged up the hill, but immediately, withering fire broke out from this hill up there, other Argentinian positions. He was seen to fall over, but he got back up and kept charging. Then, he was shot in the back and collapsed, mortally wounded, only meters away from his target. This memorial marks where Jones fell. As their commanding officer lay dying, it now fell to the second in command, Major Chris Keeble, to lead the men. 2 Para were pinned down out in the open, and they were still a mile short of their objective, the airstrip at Goose Green.
This was 2 Para's position. This is where they were pinned down by heavy fire coming from the Argentinians dug in along this ridge. Keeble decided that rather than risk more losses, he'd bring heavy fire down on the Argentinian defences on the ridge. While this was happening, 2 of his other companies moved around to the west to bring pressure on the Argentinians' flank. Slowly, 2 Para pushed forward as Argentinian fighter bombers hit them from the air. Then their luck turned, and they got their first air support of the fight. 2 Harriers swept over the battle and dropped cluster bombs on the Argentinian artillery positions. After 14 hours of intense fighting, the Para's steady progress saw them closing in on the Argentinians. But they'd taken a lot of casualties, and they were utterly exhausted. That night, Keeble decided on a cunning ploy to try and bluff the Argentinians into an early surrender. He sent a letter to the Argentinian commander. In a highly confident tone, he demanded an Argentinian surrender and warned them that he would bombard them heavily and hold them responsible for any civilian casualties if they went on fighting. Amazingly, the gamble worked. The Argentinians agreed to surrender.
The next day, the Paras were astonished to see over 900 Argentinians, nearly twice their own number, and nearly 3 times more than they had expected, lay down their weapons. After 6 weeks under Argentinian occupation, Goose Green was back in British hands, and the soldiers of 2 Para were heroes. But the battle for this tiny place had come at a huge cost.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain James, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan.
More than 70 soldiers were dead, 16 British and over 50 Argentinians.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley.
What had begun as a quick raid to seize back the airstrip and liberate the community had turned into a bloody battle in the struggle for the Falkland Islands.
The British had won the first round of their land campaign against all the odds. But ahead of them still was the battle to regain Stanley. While 2 Para had been fighting at Goose Green, the main British force had crossed the island and was now just 12 miles from the capital. But the soldiers knew they faced a tough fight between them and Stanley.
We've got to take Stanley. No stopping us now, I don't reckon. Got to get it done fast, so the only way to do it is get in there.
Do you have any feelings of apprehension then?
Oh yes, definitely. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Everything seemed to be going to plan. But then the British campaign suffered a massive blow. What followed was the largest single British loss of life in the war.
Just a few miles away from the troops, 2 landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were anchored just off this bay. They were packed with nearly 500 troops, reinforcements for the assault on Stanley. These ships should have been offloaded under cover of darkness, but a series of delays and misunderstandings meant they were still here when the sun came up. The Argentinians spotted the ships and called in their air force from the mainland. 2 Argentinian fighter bombers swept in on a deadly bombing run. They caught both ships in broad daylight, packed with troops and ammunition. "49 men were killed and a further 115 injured in the disaster.
But this British tragedy was a significant morale boost for the Argentinians. Menendez was told that 900 British had died, and he now expected a slackening in the British momentum. But he was in for a rude shock. 9 days after the landings at San Carlos, a senior commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, took overall control of the British land campaign. Undeterred by the Argentinian air attacks, Moore moved around 9,000 troops into position near the hills surrounding Stanley. The battle for Stanley was about to begin. Here's Mount Kent, where we are now. Heavy Argentinian forces lay between Moore here and the capital. He would attack in 2 stages, on 2 separate nights. On the first night, his offensive would sweep from north to south, a 3-pronged attack on the Argentinians. Moore planned to take this outer ring of hills, the largest of which was Mount Longdon in the north here. On the second night, the British would assault another ring of hills nearer Stanley, centred here on Mount Tumbledown. Success would leave them just 2 miles from Stanley. The first targets were the Argentinian troops dug in all over Mount Longdon. Mount Longdon is a natural fortress. Over 500 feet at its highest point, it dominates the surrounding moorland. For the British forces, this was a dangerous place to attack. And after their experiences at Goose Green, they didn't want their troops caught advancing in the open terrain in daylight. So they made a key decision. All the battles to retake Stanley would be fought at night.
Night fighting is a highly effective strategy. Every soldier in the British forces has to be as good at fighting in the dark as in daylight. I joined the British Army on a training exercise to experience what it's like. The attack began with flares and machine gun fire once we'd crept as close as we could in the pitch dark. It's incredibly noisy and it's actually quite bewildering. Just moving around in these conditions is very difficult. You're weighed down by your equipment. There's people tripping over, falling in the frozen stream and turning ankles. The enemy is not the only challenge in this dark and difficult terrain. Despite how hard it is to operate in the dark, it's imperative that the attacking troops don't get pinned down.
At the moment, the most important thing is we've got our attack. We've got to keep up the momentum, keep up the speed, and I guess keep the enemy off balance.
We're about to go over this rise now, and interestingly, the commander here is constantly telling everyone what's going on in the rest of the battlefield. Even though it's only 50 or 100 metres away, it's very confusing in the dark. We can just hear firing and lots of shouting. So he's constantly going around telling everyone what stage we're at, trying to keep everything going to plan. For the British troops on the Falklands, keeping to the plan and maintaining momentum would be the key to their success when fighting at night. At 8 PM on the 11th of June, the British forces began their attack on Mount Longdon. But 3 Para, who were spearheading the advance, found themselves trapped in a bewildering maze of steep-sided alleyways.
These narrow gullies here channeled the men into the killing grounds of the Argentinian machine gunners and snipers up above. Then grenades were rolled down in amongst them. One officer compared it to like being stuck in a bowling alley.
The grenades, they were just bouncing down the side of the rock face. We thought there were rocks falling, till the first one exploded.
Despite mounting casualties, the men pushed forward. One sergeant, Ian Mackay, dashed up a slope and knocked out a stubborn Argentinian position. He was killed, but later awarded the Victoria Cross. For 7 hours, the British forces battled their way up Mount Longdon. Their assault was just too forceful for the Argentinians to hold off.
So desperate were the Argentinians to smash the British attack that Menendez risked his own men's lives by ordering his own artillery to bring down fire on their own positions here on Mount Longdon. But it didn't do any good. By 6:30 AM, the British had captured the mountain.
As day broke, the British brought in the dead and injured from both sides. Most of the Argentinian casualties and prisoners were conscript soldiers, young men drafted into the army. While these soldiers had fought well, many of them were worn down by the conditions before the battle had begun. Some of them were even captured in their positions, like this one, huddled up in their sleeping bags trying to escape the battle and the cold.
I am tired, cold, unhappy. I swear that I can't take it anymore, even though this is my duty as a man and a soldier of the fatherland.
Although this had been a bloody battle for both sides, the British attacks had taken all the high ground they'd planned to on the first night. But another night's fighting still lay ahead. Of the remaining mountains that had to be captured on the second night, by far the most vital was that one over there. That's Tumbledown, the last major obstacle between the British and Stanley.
The men charged with recapturing Tumbledown were the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guards. Just 8 weeks earlier, they'd been on ceremonial duties like guarding Buckingham Palace. This would be the first experience of war for many of them, and they now had to confront perhaps the toughest target of the campaign.
If
If the Argentinians lost Tumbledown, they lost Stanley. So they'd put their best men up here, the elite 5th Marines. 700 heavily armed crack troops were dug into the protected positions in the caves and rocks high on the mountain. These Argentinian Marines had been trained to fight at night, and they outnumbered the attacking British forces by almost 2 to 1. The Argentinians were confident they could hold the British off. As soon as darkness fell, the fighting began.
Aye, it was murder. We were coming under mortar fire, machine gun fire, sniper fire. You name it, it was coming towards us. Well, it's a saying, expect the unexpected. And that was unexpected. You cannot really describe it. Nobody could describe it if they've not been there.
3 hours into the battle, things were going badly for the British. The Scots Guards' attack had come to a complete halt.
They were taunting us, the odd word in English, calling us to come on, and I think they mentioned surrender. The combination of cold, uncertainty and the general awareness that we were stuck led to the group ego shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. At that stage I thought we had blown it.
That's my Tumbledown behind me up there. And here it is on the map case. The Scots Guards had approached Tumbledown from the west and made their way up this slope here unopposed. But now one company, about 120 men, were pinned down here by stiff opposition from the Argentinians positioned in the rocks and crags up above, on top of the ridge here. Then 30 Scots Guards climbed up onto higher ground to the north, undetected by the Argentinians down below. Now they were able to bring sustained fire down on the Argentinians' exposed flank. The rest of the company stalled the Argentinian strong point. The Scots had made the breakthrough.
As dawn broke, the battle was still raging on Tumbledown, and the British forces prepared to throw everything they had into the fight for Stanley. They hammered the remaining enemy positions in a final all-out bombardment. Soon Argentinian troops could be seen fleeing. The British troops had effectively destroyed their enemy's will to fight, and the Argentinians retreated, flooding back into Stanley in their hundreds. The Argentinian resistance was crumbling. As the demoralized defenders poured into Stanley, the men were heard arguing with their superiors. Discipline among the Argentinian troops was breaking down. It wasn't long before they were surrounded.
And on the 14th of June, the British demanded the Argentinians surrender. Realizing that he had little choice, Menendez accepted. After 2.5 months, the battle for the Falklands was over.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The Argentinians had occupied Stanley for 74 days. But now, as 2 Para marched into the capital, it was back in British hands.
A month later, the first British troops arrived back home to jubilant celebrations. This victory had given people a renewed sense of pride in their country and a feeling that Britain could lift itself out of its recent decline.
And riding on the crest of this success was Margaret Thatcher. Within a year, she won the general election with a resounding majority. The Iron Lady had cemented her position as a major world leader.
In Argentina, the news of the surrender was taken very badly. Far from uniting the people, the war had left the Argentinians furious at the army and the government.
Just 3 days after Argentina's defeat, Galtieri was forced from power and military rule collapsed in Argentina.
Over in the Falklands, the legacy of this bitter conflict lives on. Nearly 1,000 people died in the war, 252 British servicemen, 3 Falkland Islanders, and almost 700 Argentinians.
After the war, the British government offered to return the bodies of the Argentinian dead to Argentina for burial, but their government refused. They said that these islands were part of Argentina and the bodies would remain here.
For the Falkland Islanders, these graves are a daily reminder that Argentina refuses to drop its claim to their homeland.
After the war ended, Britain greatly increased its permanent military presence on the islands. Now there's 1 serviceman for every 2 civilians living here. Today the islanders are still determined the Falklands remain British. As long as Britain continues to respect their wishes, there'll be no early end to this bitter territorial dispute. Next time, in 1991, Kuwait was at the center of the last major war of the 20th century. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had invaded, leading to a battle unlike anything seen before.
I'll be getting to grips with some of the challenges faced by the men and women on the front line.
And I'm going to be explaining the tactics of a war dominated by cutting-edge technology. It was called Operation Desert Storm, the battle for Kuwait.
Bueno, con esto damos por finalizado el documental de la BBC de Londres. Creo que fue muy esclarecedor porque contó el otro lado de la guerra. 2 datitos. El primero, que eso que ustedes vieron de que las tropas ingresaban a Puerto Argentino e izaban la bandera británica, no ocurrió el 14 de junio. Ocurrió el 15 al mediodía. ¿Por qué? Porque el camarógrafo de la BBC no venía en primera línea, venía más atrás y no había llegado para poder cubrir ese evento. El otro datito es que, por supuesto, las imágenes de Puerto Argentino ustedes la recontra conocen porque son mías. Pero yo quiero resumir este documental con un libro escrito por Julian Thompson, que estuvo como jefe de la 3ª Brigada de Comando en Malvinas. El libro es este, y su título es No Picnic. Creo que el título del libro habla de lo que ellos vivieron en la Guerra de Malvinas. Bueno, la semana que viene tocaremos otro tema, esta vez volveremos otra vez con imágenes argentinas, pero este video yo lo quería mostrar porque es muy esclarecedor para mucha gente que me escribe y me pregunta cosas de si los ingleses realmente la habían pasado bien o la habían pasado mal. Y ustedes lo vieron, la pasaron mal y muy mal. Nos despedimos hasta la semana que viene como lo hago siempre. Dios y patria o muerte.
Medalla en el pecho, clavada en el corazón y una visión de Dios. de celeste y blanco, navegando entre los mares. En las noches ves fantasmas que muerden el pabellón. En las aguas bajo el frío duerme. ¿Quién guardará tu plegaria del viento? ¿A quién borrará nuestras lágrimas del mar? Siento al dormir tus muletas en llamas y en sueños volverás a caminar.